If we look at the figures of the air industry in this 2026, we will find a paradox. On one hand, the airports are more full than ever, with millions of passengers flying to all corners of the planet. On the other hand, the accounts of results of many airlines continue tinged with red. The costs of the fuel skyrocket, the competition of the airlines of low-cost squeezes, the passengers are each time more demanding, and the debts accumulated during the health crisis weigh like a slab. For that, today we are going to know 12 airlines that are declaring losses in this 2026. Norwegian Air Shuttle, the low cost that does not lift head. There was a time in which Norwegian Air Shuttle was the great hope of the European aviation. A low-cost airline that dared with transatlantic routes, that offered cheap tickets to New York or Los Angeles from secondary cities, and that grew at an unstoppable rhythm. But that growth had a price, an astronomical debt, and an uncontrolled expansion. When the pandemic paralyzed the world in 2020, Norwegian stayed without income from the night to the morning. Its airplanes, hundreds of them, stayed on ground. The Norwegian airline entered in bankruptcy of creditors and had to restructure itself completely. It canceled routes, returned airplanes, fired personnel, and centered on its Nordic market. It seemed that it had learned the lesson. But in 2026, Norwegian continues without lifting head. The problems are several. On one hand, the competition in Scandinavia is fierce, with SAS fighting for surviving and with other low costs like Ryanair stepping on ground. On the other hand, the costs have risen. The fuel, the salaries, the airport taxes, and the debt, although reduced, continues being a slab. Norwegian declared losses in 2024, also in 2025, and everything points to that 2026 will be another year in red numbers. The question is, how much time will it be able to endure? SAS Scandinavian Airlines, the burden of the labor costs. If Norwegian suffers for its expansive past, SAS Scandinavian Airlines suffers for its structure of costs. The flag airline of Sweden, Denmark, and Norway carries years in a desperate fight for being profitable, and the results do not accompany. The principal problem of SAS are its labor costs. The collective agreements in Scandinavia are of the most generous of the world. High salaries, reduced workdays, long vacations, and union protections very strong. That is very good for the workers, but for an airline that competes with low cost like Norwegian, which also had its problems, or Ryanair, it is an impossible slab to lift. SAS has to pay much more to its pilots and crew members than its competitors, and that reflects in the price of the tickets. The airline has tried to restructure itself in multiple occasions. In 2022, it took refuge in Chapter 11 of the American bankruptcy law to protect itself from its creditors. It came out of that process with a structure more light, but the labor costs continue being very high. In 2026, SAS continues declaring losses. The Scandinavian governments, which are shareholders, are tired of putting money. If the airline does not find a strong industrial partner that injects capital and management, its future is very uncertain. Air France KLM, the European giant that bleeds. Air France KLM is one of the biggest air groups of Europe, but its size does not free it from the problems. The Franco-Dutch group carries years dragging losses in some of its divisions, and 2026 will not be an exception. The problems of Air France KLM are several. On one hand, the competition of the airlines of the Gulf, like Emirates, Qatar Airways, and Etihad, that offer connections of quality at very competitive prices, and steal passengers on the routes to Asia. On the other hand, the low cost in Europe that pressure the prices to the low. And by last, the labor costs in France, where the unions have an enormous strength and any attempt of reform finds a fierce resistance. Air France, the French part of the group, is the one that most losses accumulates. KLM, the Dutch, usually goes better, but not enough to compensate. The group has tried to restructure itself, cut routes, reduce fleet, but the results do not arrive. In 2026, Air France KLM will return to declare losses. The question is for how much time more the shareholders will be willing to endure. The Franco-Dutch group drags the burden of a structure of costs much superior to that of its low-cost competitors. The routes of short radio within Europe operated by Air France lose money in each flight against the competition of Ryanair and EasyJet. Meanwhile, the division of cargo that during years was a lifesaver has seen fall the freights after the end of the post-pandemic bubble. The French unions block any attempt of labor adjustment, and the integration with KLM that should generate synergies continues without giving the expected fruits decades after the fusion. Lufthansa, the German airline that does not finish recovering. Lufthansa is the other great European giant. During decades, it was the pride of the German aviation, synonym of efficiency and quality. But the last years have been hard, the pandemic hit strong, and although the airline received help from the German government, the recovery is being slow. In 2026, Lufthansa continues declaring losses in some of its divisions. The operative costs are high, the competition in Europe is fierce, and the routes of long distance do not finish recovering the pre-pandemic levels. Additionally, the group has to make front-to-millionaire investments to renew its fleet and adapt to the new environmental standards. Lufthansa has tried to diversify itself with airlines like Swiss, Austrian, and Brussels under its umbrella. But even those, which usually are more profitable, are not enough to compensate the losses of the parent company. The German group continues on the tightrope, and 2026 will be another year of red numbers. Alitalia, ITA Airways, the eternal Italian crisis. To speak of Alitalia is to speak of a crisis that never ends. The Italian flag airline carries decades accumulating losses, rescued once and again by the Italian government, and sold and resold to investors that never managed to straighten it. In 2021, Alitalia closed its doors and ITA Airways was born, a new airline that inherited part of its assets but not its debts. It seemed a new beginning, but the problems of ITA Airways are the same as those of the old Alitalia. Labor costs very high, routes little profitable, fierce competition from the low-cost and from the airlines of the Gulf. The Italian government, which continues being a shareholder, has tried to look for a private partner, but the negotiations prolong. In 2026, ITA Airways continues declaring losses. The airline does not manage to be profitable, and the Italian taxpayers continue paying the bill. The question is, how much time more will this model be able to endure? Will an investor arrive that rescues it, or will we finish assisting to another chapter of the eternal Italian crisis? TAP Air Portugal, the Portuguese airline on the tightrope. TAP Air Portugal is another of those airlines that carry years on the tightrope. The Portuguese flag airline has a strategic position in the door of entry to Europe, with connections to Brazil and Africa that are its principal asset, but that is not enough to be profitable. The problems of TAP are several. On one hand, the competition in the Iberian Peninsula is fierce, with Iberia, Ryanair, and other low-cost fighting for the same cake. On the other hand, the labor costs, although not so high as in Scandinavia, continue being a burden, and the debt accumulated during the pandemic is enormous. The Portuguese government has tried to privatize TAP in several occasions, but the investors do not finish launching themselves. In 2026, the airline continues declaring losses. The cuts of routes and the reduction of fleet have not been enough. TAP needs a deep restructuring, but the unions resist. The future of the Portuguese airline is uncertain, but Europe is not the only continent where the airlines suffer. To the other side of the Atlantic in Latin America, the situation is not much better. In Asia, giants like Thai Airways or Garuda Indonesia continue in restructuring, and in Africa, South African Airways returns to be at the edge of the abyss, and those will be the ones that we will see next. South African Airways, the airline that resurrects and returns to die. South African Airways is the perfect example of how not to manage an aerial company. Founded in 1934, it was during decades the flag airline of South Africa, a national pride that connected the country with Europe, Asia, and America. But the problem started much before the pandemic. Bad management, corruption, routes politically motivated but economically unfeasible, and a competition each time more fierce by part of private airlines like FlySafair and British Airways Comair were mining its financial health. In 2020, when the COVID paralyzed the world, South African Airways entered in bankruptcy of creditors. It seemed the end. But the South African government, in a desperate attempt for saving the thousands of posts of work and the national pride, injected thousands of millions of rands to rescue it. The problem is that the rescue did not come accompanied of a deep restructuring. The costs continued being very high, the fleet composed of Airbus airplanes continued aging, and the passengers that had discovered other options did not return in the expected quantity. In 2026, South African Airways is again at the edge of the precipice. The profitable routes like Johannesburg-London have been taken over by foreign airlines like Emirates, Qatar Airways, and British Airways. In the domestic market, FlySafair eats its toast with lower prices and an efficiency that the state airline cannot equal. The debt accumulated exceeds the $1,000 million, and the South African government, with economic problems of its own, already cannot continue injecting money. The workers denounce delays in the payments, the providers demand collections in cash, and the fleet is reduced for lack of maintenance. South African Airways is a terminal patient in an ICU without electricity. It returns to declare losses, and its disappearance is only a matter of time. The situation of South African Airways is so precarious that its own workers carry months without collecting. The providers demand payments by advance, and the fleet is reduced because there is no money for maintaining the airplanes. Meanwhile, the South African government negotiates with private investors that do not finish concretizing their offers. Each week that passes without a solution, the airline nears itself a little more to the definitive abyss. Aerolíneas Argentinas, the eternal Argentine problem. To speak of Aerolíneas Argentinas is to speak of a classic in the lists of airlines in crisis. The Argentine flag airline carries decades giving losses, and the successive governments, whether Peronists or Macrists, have tried to privatize it, sell it, close it, or rescue it without success. The problem is structural and seems to not have solution. Aerolíneas Argentinas has an oversized staff with some labor costs very high that are fruit of decades of collective agreements favorable to the unions. It has an inefficient fleet with old airplanes that consume more fuel than the modern ones, and it has a network of routes that includes destinations little profitable like flights to Patagonian provinces that are maintained for political reasons, not economic. Each time that a government tries to cut routes or reduce personnel, the unions paralyze the country with strikes and the government retreats. In 2026, the situation is more grave than ever. Argentina crosses a deep economic crisis with an inflation that exceeds the 100% annual, a constant devaluation of its currency, and some international reserves under minimums. The government does not have money for continuing subsidizing the airline, which needs monthly transfers of tens of millions of dollars to survive. The attempts of reducing costs clash with the union opposition, and the passengers, fed up with the delays and the cancellations, opt for foreign airlines like LATAM, Copa, or American Airlines to fly abroad, and for low-cost like Flybondi or JetSmart to fly within the country. Aerolíneas Argentinas is technically in bankruptcy and only survives thanks to state helps that are each time more difficult to justify. The losses accumulate year after year, and a solution is not glimpsed. The company drags an operative deficit that exceeds the $500 million annual. The flights to Patagonian destinations, maintained for political reasons, lose money in each journey, and the government, asphyxiated by the crisis, studies closing entire routes. What would provoke a union conflict of unpredictable dimensions? The balance is impossible. LATAM Airlines, the incomplete recovery. LATAM Airlines is the result of the fusion between the Chilean LAN and the Brazilian TAM, and during years was the giant indisputable of South America. But the pandemic hit with force to the region, and LATAM was not an exception. In 2020, the airline took refuge in Chapter 11 of the American bankruptcy law, a process that allowed it to restructure its debt and continue operating while it negotiated with its creditors. The process lasted more than 2 years. LATAM had to return airplanes, cancel routes, fire personnel, and renegotiate contracts. It came out of Chapter 11 in 2022 with a structure more light and a reduced debt. It seemed that the worst had passed, but in 2026, LATAM continues declaring losses. The recovery has not been so fast as they expected. The competition in South America is fierce, with airlines like Avianca, Gol, and the low-cost fighting for the same cake. The costs of the fuel have skyrocketed, and the inflation in countries like Argentina and Brazil affects the demand. Additionally, LATAM has to make front-to-millionaire investments to renew its fleet and adapt to the new environmental standards. The residual losses are a reality, and the shareholders start to get impatient. LATAM needs to find the formula for being profitable, and for the moment it does not manage it. In spite of having come out of Chapter 11, LATAM drags financial costs inherited from its restructuring. The inflation in Brazil and Argentina reduces the purchasing power of the passengers, and the war of prices with the low cost does not give truce. The profitability continues being a pending subject. Garuda Indonesia, the Indonesian airline asphyxiated by the debt. Indonesia is an archipelago of more than 17,000 islands, and to fly is often the only form of moving. With a demand so big, the airlines of low cost have proliferated like mushrooms. Garuda Indonesia, the flag airline, should be the queen of that market, but the reality is very different. Garuda carries years asphyxiated by a multi-millionaire debt. The problems come from far bad management, corruption, uncontrolled expansion, and an oversized fleet. The pandemic was a mortal blow. The airplanes stayed on ground, the income disappeared, and the debt made itself unsustainable. In 2021, Garuda entered in bankruptcy of creditors. It tried to restructure its debt, negotiate with the lessors of airplanes, and reduce its fleet, but the process has been slow and complicated. In 2026, the airline continues declaring losses. The competition of the low cost like Lion Air is fierce, and Garuda cannot compete in prices. Its costs are more high, its fleet is more old, and its service, although better, is not enough to attract the passengers that look for cheap tickets. The Indonesian government has had to inject money in several occasions, but already cannot more. Garuda needs a miracle to get out of this situation, and for the moment it does not appear. The lessors of airplanes have begun to recover apparatuses before the lack of payments. The fleet of Garuda is reduced month by month, and with it its capacity of generating income. The Indonesian government studies a forced fusion with other local airlines to avoid the total collapse. Thai Airways, the Thai giant that continues in restructuring. Thailand is one of the most popular tourist destinations of the world. Millions of travelers arrive each year to its beaches, its temples, and its cities, and Thai Airways, the flag airline, should be the great benefited of that tourist flow, but it is not. Thai Airways carries years in an interminable restructuring. In 2020, the airline took refuge in the Thai bankruptcy law, a process similar to the American Chapter 11. Since then, it has been negotiating with its creditors, returning airplanes, canceling routes, and reducing personnel. But in 2026, Thai Airways continues declaring losses. The problems are several. On one hand, the competition of the airlines of the Gulf and of the Asian low cost is fierce. On the other hand, the labor costs in Thailand, although not so high as in Europe, continue being a burden, and the recovery of the tourism, although real, has not been so fast as was expected. Thai Airways needs to find a strategic partner or an injection of capital that allows it to get out of this situation. For the moment, the losses accumulate and the future is uncertain. The plan of restructuring approved by the courts includes the sale of non-strategic assets like buildings and participations in companies, but the income generated are insufficient. The recovery of the tourism in Thailand does not reach the predicted figures and the losses become entrenched. Malaysia Airlines, the airline of the tragedies, continues in losses. There are airlines that have suffered accidents, that have passed through crises, that have had to restructure themselves, but few have lived what Malaysia Airlines. In 2014, the Malaysian Airlines suffered two of the greatest tragedies of the history of the aviation. On March 8th, the Flight 370 disappeared from the radar with 239 people on board. To this day, it is not known what happened. The remains never appeared. The theories multiply. The mystery continues without resolving. 4 months later, on July 17, the Flight 17 was shot down by a missile over Ukraine, killing the 298 people that traveled on board. Those two blows, united to a deficient management and to the fierce competition in the Southeast Asia, carried Malaysia Airlines to the edge of the bankruptcy. The passengers stopped flying with it, the routes emptied, the losses accumulated. The Malaysian government, owner of the airline, had to nationalize it again and inject money to save it. In the following years, Malaysia Airlines tried to restructure itself. It reduced fleet, canceled routes, fired personnel, changed image, but the burden of the accidents continues being very heavy. Each time that someone looks for a flight to Malaysia, remembers what happened. Each time that a passenger goes up to an airplane of Malaysia Airlines, thinks on the 370, in 2026, the airline continues declaring losses. The competition in the Southeast Asia is fierce. Singapore Airlines, Thai Airways, Vietnam Airlines, the low-cost like AirAsia all fight for the same cake. Malaysia Airlines is one more, and it is not the best. Its fleet is old, its service is improvable, its image is damaged. The airline looks for investors, but the negotiations prolong. If Malaysia Airlines does not find a strong industrial partner that helps it to resurge, its future is very uncertain. The losses continue, and the end of this story yet has not been written. The Malaysian government has resumed the conversations with potential investors, between them Japan Airlines and Qatar Airways. But the conditions imposed by the possible buyers include massive layoffs and cuts of routes that result politically unacceptable. The stagnation is total. Fiji Airways, the dependence of the tourism pays bill. In middle of the Pacific Ocean, at thousands of kilometers from any continent, there is a small paradise called Fiji. Its beaches of white sand, its turquoise waters, and its luxury resorts attract travelers from all the world. And the person in charge of bringing those travelers is Fiji Airways, the flag airline of this insular country. But to depend on the tourism has a price, and in 2026, Fiji Airways is paying it dear. The history of Fiji Airways is the history of a relative success. Founded in 1951, it has achieved to connect these lost islands with destinations like Australia, New Zealand, United States, and some points of Asia. Its fleet, although small, is modern, with airplanes Airbus A330 and Boeing 737 that offer a service very appreciated by the travelers, but its size is also its principal weakness. When the pandemic closed borders in 2020, Fiji Airways was at the edge of the collapse. The tourism, which represents a third of the GDP of Fiji, paralyzed itself completely. The airline stopped receiving practically all and had to resort to help from the government and to international loans to survive. It survived, yes, but stayed very weakened. In 2026, the recovery has not been so fast as they expected. The world tourism has resented itself for the inflation, the geopolitical tensions, and the changes in the habits of travel. Additionally, the competition in the Pacific is each time greater. Airlines like Qantas, Air New Zealand, American Airlines, and United have increased their flights to the islands, offering direct connections from their hubs that compete directly with the routes of Fiji Airways. The airline needs to diversify itself, find new routes and new markets that do not depend so much on the vacational tourism. It has tried to open flights to destinations like Tokyo, Singapore, or Vancouver, but it is not easy to compete with the great Asian ones. Also, it needs to renew its fleet, but the new airplanes cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, and Fiji Airways does not have that money. The government of Fiji, which is the principal shareholder, cannot continue injecting funds without limit. The losses accumulate, and the airline looks desperately for a solution. The airline has tried to open routes to destinations less seasonal, like Tokyo or Vancouver, but the competition of the great Asian ones is insuperable. Its fleet, although modern, is too small to compete in volume. The government of Fiji studies a strategic alliance with Qantas, but the negotiations are in dead point. The time runs in against. Until here, the 12 airlines that are declaring losses in this 2026. From South Africa until Indonesia, passing through Argentina, Thailand, or Fiji, all share the same fragility. The aviation is a business of margins very adjusted, where any crisis can be the final blow. Some of these airlines have more than 100 years of history. Others are relatively young, but all are today at the edge of the abyss. If you have tickets with some of them, maintain yourself informed. Follow the news, look if your flights are canceled, and if it is necessary, claim. And if you are thinking in buying a cheap ticket with one of these airlines, think if it deserves the worth the risk. Because a cheap ticket can come out very expensive if they leave you stranded at thousands of kilometers from home.